Hello and welcome to another Atypling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and my esteemed writing colleague, Dr. Aaron Adair. And we are going to continue our foray into the world of archaeology, history, biblical exegesis, philosophy, all of the domains that we need to be looking at when trying to decipher the historicity of the Exodus accounts and the existence of Moses, and indeed, as we're going to talk today, the existence even of the God Yahweh and Israel in terms of the time frame that we need them to be around for when considering if these stories happened in the way that was detailed in the biblical accounts. And what we're going to be doing is looking at external, extra biblical evidence. We're going to look at archaeological evidence, but importantly as well, internal evidence within the Bible. And this is an area that I don't think is given enough sort of time and effort when looking at the historicity of some of these stories. The idea that the Bible itself doesn't have a very coherent approach to establishing chronologies and when it's thought that certain stories existed or took place, we are left wondering, well, what does the Bible say about even the existence of God at this time or Israel at this time? And what does history tell us? And what does archaeology tell us? So on and so forth. So today, this is a long introduction. I'll let Aaron go for it in a second. But today we're going to be looking at essentially whether, to begin with, whether Yahweh existed, literally God, capital G God, as Christians and Jews would have it, at the time claimed for the story of Exodus. And Aaron's going to remind us of the important dates of that to begin with, as to what traditional scholars and believers believe. But whether Yahweh existed, and then we're going to look at actually whether even Israel existed. When did Israel come to be? And by that, we're going to be looking at the 12 tribes, explaining the situation there. And then also whether Moses actually existed or could have existed at this time by looking at other claims concerning him and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the video, we are going to be answering some of the comments that were added to our previous video. So anyway, Aaron, welcome. And do you just want to you don't need to reintroduce yourself, you've been on enough, I guess. Do you want to just reestablish the two main potential times for the story of Exodus, of Moses and the Hebrew people coming out of Egypt?
Yeah. So there are a bunch of different ways that you can try to calculate when the Exodus is supposed to happen based on the biblical evidence. It doesn't give a clear year, to say the least. Different clues point to things in different centuries, but broadly everything fits into what archaeologists call the late Bronze Age. The traditional date for the Exodus is going to be sometime in the 1400s, around 1440. You can more directly calculate, but that has its own problems, both textual and archaeological. But the 15th century is a commonplace traditionalists will point to based on a statement from 1 Kings chapter 6. If you go by other internal clues to the Bible that seems to suggest, hey, the Israelites are doing stuff in and after the reign of Ramesses, then this would place the Exodus in the 13th century, in the 1200s. And the best clue that we can look at externally that it has to be no later than the 1200s is a stele the Egyptians built, the Merneptah stele, built or set up somewhere around 1208 BC, that mentions Israel and seems to be placing them in the Holy Land. So if they're there by 1208, then the Exodus has to be before then. There's at least one prominent scholar who's tried to argue even against that, but nonetheless, the vast majority would say, hey, Israel has to have left Egypt before then, and between the 15th century and the 13th century is where the vast majority of scholars would point to.
And if we take the Merneptah stele inscription of Israel as representing this military victory over Israel from the Egyptians, then you would assume actually it needs to happen probably quite considerably before 1208. You would have thought, just not necessarily, but you'd have an intuition that would be So we have a window then from sort of, broadly speaking, mid 1400s BCE to maybe mid late. Yeah. So that's a good place to start. Now, what we're going to start with was like, okay, if then the Bible is telling us that the Exodus story happened in this window, what does everything else, anthropologists are very interested in, is what does history and archaeology, comparative histories of the region and whatnot, tell us about the existence of Yahweh? Because if Yahweh as a god hadn't evolved as far as we understand it, now we need to park, if you're sort of a conservative or Orthodox Jew, conservative Christian, you need to park the idea that Yahweh clearly existed just as an assertion since time immemorial. Let's just forget that. But let's look at history. How do we understand the evolution of the god Yahweh? And then does that fit in with this time frame of Moses interacting with Yahweh in order to come out of Egypt into Canaan across the Jordan? We have Yahweh killing many Egyptians with the plagues. Yahweh has to have existed here, but history doesn't really help the believer here, because it's not very well. I think it's clear actually that Yahweh didn't exist at this time period. Is that a fair conclusion to make? And how do we start looking at the data?
Well, of course, it's clear to us, evil skeptics and all that, but let's try to treat this in a secular way, in the sense we're going to study Yahweh in the same way we study the Greek gods. So an example of what you can look at that indicates where a pantheon of gods or collections of gods can have complex histories. So if you are a reader of the early stories the Greeks have, such from Hesiod and his Theogony, tells like the origins of the gods. We have the Kronos giving birth to all the gods, but of course eating them until getting fooled by his wife feeding him a rock instead of Zeus, and then Zeus, of course, coming to power and fighting all that. We get all those gods were all supposed to basically be children of Kronos, with an exception. Jonathan, do you remember how Aphrodite comes about?
No, but she's not Greek, if I remember correctly.
In her origin, yes. In Hesiod's tale, the origins of Aphrodite is that when Kronos went and attacked his father and basically very castrated him with a sickle, his testicles fell into the sea, foamed up, and that formed Aphrodite from the sea, which is a very different origin.
That's an amazing story. Like, as an aside here, Aaron, like, we have lost something in modern history that we don't have. Like, we don't tell our children tales of this that involve like castrating gods and new gods.
We don't have the balls to tell this story.
Very good. It's like a perverted version of Mogwai in the Gremlins. Don't add water. Don't cut off the testicles into the sea. Yes. So
yeah. So it's a weird thing, but the key thing I bring this up is, hey, Aphrodite is somehow different from all the other gods. Is that because she actually comes to the pantheon by a different means, and then the story is trying to explain that? Because if we go back, one of the things also is not just that the testes fall into the sea, but specifically it's supposed to happen near Cyprus. That's oddly specific. And when we start doing some of the archaeology, we find, the oldest cults to Aphrodite come from Cyprus and then come to the Greek mainland, coming through Sparta and then later into more northern parts of Greece, where then we get the other traditions of Aphrodite, and a big collection of them as well. In Sparta, she's actually a warrior goddess. Later, she gets her martial abilities get taken out. In Homer's Iliad, she has like no war abilities at all. In fact, she gets her butt kicked by mortals in the battles in around Troy. So complete change there. But you go back, she's a warrior goddess related to sex and love. That's a bit weird, but there is a ancient Near Eastern goddess that this is also derivative of, Astarte, who is derivative of Ishtar, who is derivative of Inanna. So we can actually trace back and see where Aphrodite comes from, going back all the way to ancient Sumer, using archaeology, textual evidence, and little indications from Greek traditions. And I'm saying, let's rinse and repeat and do that for Yahweh. And of course, this is theological heresy. Heresy. Obviously, God has always existed before time. Whatever that means, I'm not going to try to explain that today. But archaeologically,
causally prior to time, as we might say philosophically.
Yeah. Or God isn't actually a being, but the source of being. And again, I'm not going to try to explain that because that's where words stop working in my head. But yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Well, so we're then trying to work out, as you say, as we've done with Aphrodite, what was the evolution of Yahweh, and what is the earliest extant evidence that we have of Yahweh? Any mention of Yahweh?
Yeah, well, obviously the Bible as written by Moses, but okay. But there is one thing worth noting. If we go to Exodus and we see the conversations between Moses and the Pharaoh, the name of Yahweh is actually spoken by Pharaoh. He knows the name of this God. This is not a secret to him or the Egyptians. Go through the book of Exodus and you can see Pharaoh and other Egyptians using the name Yahweh. This would not be a mystery term to them or something only kept secret and held by the Hebrews. So if the Egyptians know the name, do the Egyptians show any evidence that they knew and used this name from the various writings, inscriptions that they left behind, and see if that tells us anything? And lo and behold, indeed, the oldest apparent mention of the name Yahweh is in multiple Egyptian inscriptions over a couple of centuries.
Yes.
But in what context?
Yes.
So, our first one, it's coming from the 1400s, if memory serves, and it is a collection of inscriptions to, I have to triple check that I got the names right, but I think it's for Amenhotep III, and it's at one of his temples, and he's basically showing, again, what do you do when you're an Egyptian pharaoh in your temples? You have to show off just how awesome you are, all the stuff you have, how much gold you have, how many donkeys you have, how many lands you control. And the best way to show how many lands you control is go through them and itemize them. So around the various pillars in this temple are the layouts of the lands controlled by Egypt. And at this time, Egypt is one of its largest extents in its entire history. So got a lot of lands to talk about. A lot of real estate deals happening in
what time is this?
Egypt.
It's talk of years.
Yeah, I think the 1400s. I need to triple check exactly when that temple was built, but I think mid-late 1400s.
Right.
Yeah. And so it's going through all these territories and peoples, and it gets to a group known as the Shasu. The Shasu have probably also been heard before by some of the people in the audience because this is a people group all still associated with the Israelites, the Exodus tradition, because they get mentioned a bunch of times in Egyptian texts as being a nomadic people, and also because of this inscription thinking, oh, they must be related to the Israelites because in these inscriptions it talks about the Shasu of Yahweh. And everyone's like, holy shnikes, I think I know this one. So it's okay. But all right. Now there's a few things. So where are the Shasu? That is not clear from these inscriptions because all these territory names, a lot of them are not exactly clear. There aren't signposts outside saying where all these regions are. So there's a fair bit of contextual clues that we try to say, like maybe roughly this region, but more or less the Shasu are living somewhere in the vicinity of the Levant. And the Shasu are nomadic people. They're not like a nation, and they probably live in a whole bunch of different places and move around a bit, kind of similar to modern day Bedouins. Now, in those inscriptions, I mentioned, yeah, there's a shasu of Yahweh, but there's also shasu of a whole bunch of other things. And we look at them and realize these aren't actually gods. These aren't like the shasu of this god or of this god or of this god. These are actually territorial designations. And again, the whole point of this temple complex is to show off all the territories controlled by the pharaoh. So when it talks about the shasu of Yahweh, it seems to be saying that this Yahweh or Yahweh is a territorial name. And we see
So
this, yeah. Well,
in other words, this is not Yahweh the God. This is Yahweh the people or place.
Yes.
And then the question is going to be, as I'm sure you're just about to elucidate, is that what's the direction of causality there? Like, what evidence do we have that people and places get named after a god, or that gods get named after a people and place? And so, you know, even though that we have evidence that Yahweh existed as an entity, whatever this may be, it's not clear that actually that refers to a god.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also worth noting this is not even the only inscription. We also have inscriptions later in the Ramesside period and a little bit after, also using the designation of Shasu of Yahweh, and again in a territorial context. So the name is used for centuries, is always being treated as a territorial moniker by the Egyptians, never as, oh, that one god that came in, kicked all of our asses, destroyed our armies, and took all our labor force away. It's never in that context. It's just, yeah, that region over there that we kind of control. It's completely banal by comparison. And again, a very weird thing if the pharaoh himself knows and has used that very name. So what the halibut is going on, and yeah, what's the direction of causality? Because this is part of some of the discussion, and this is probably the book that's influenced the most of how I'm trying to go with this relatively recent book by Daniel Fleming. As if they can't read the title, it says Yahweh Before Israel. So, you know, pretty provocative title there. On the front cover is actually one of the pillar drums from that temple from Egypt. And part of the evidence of trying to figure out what's going on and trying to find other exemplars of how regional designations could then possibly become personal designations and then becoming god name designations, and trying to show like other examples from Arabia or from the Levant more generally of regions or people names them becoming like an ancestor. So you become like there's actually probably the best example I can give is for the Greeks. Lots of the Greek kingdoms claimed ancestry from Hercules. So they became known basically as the Herculeans, to not use the Greek term for that, but basically saying, hey, we go back to Hercules, and that's of course why we have our dynastic rights, and all you peasants need to get back to work. That's how these stories tend to go, right?
So
Yeah.
with those stories, are the people ascribing then, is it etiological? So etiology is this kind of like trying to explain data points by making up a story that would do the job of explaining why that's
Yes.
called like it is. So for example, there's a pillar of salt near the Dead Sea, isn't there? And that hence the Sodom and Gomorrah, you know, turning Lot's wife to a pillar of salt is an etiological story to explain why there's an actual kind of pillar,
Yes.
geographical feature. You know, it just explains that a bit like Uluru or, you know, Ayers Rock in Australia. You will get the indigenous population explaining the evolution, the genesis of that rock, of that geographical feature. So with these Herculeans, are they ascribing their name to post facto to God, or was a god believed, or to Hercules? Sorry, or did Hercules, did they take their name from Hercules?
Of course, that's hard to tell because that ultimately goes back into the fog of history where we don't have the records well.
Yeah.
So was Hercules originally a folk hero, then became a god, was a god, and then made more historical? That's well outside my ability to say. But
Yeah.
if we go back to the ancient Near East, the region there, that might be a little bit more direct. We do have a few things from both the Bible and from our most ancient Hebrew adjacent language records. So if we go back to the Bible, it talks actually also about the Israelites as being children of Yahweh, or like you are like the sons of Yahweh, and using this kind of old designation for that. And we find a very similar language in the Mesha stele. This was a stele erected by a Moabite king named Mesha, King Mesha. Got to name things after yourself. And he also talks about his own battles with the Israelites. And he also says like how we, the children of Chemosh, their patron god, and their patron god coming to their rescue and kicking the butt of the Israelites and their god Yahweh. This is also our earliest reference to Yahweh as a god. So spoiler alert for that. But we see this sort of designation that, Chemosh is in some ways the father figure to the Moabites. There are things in the Bible that also suggest the Israelites are the children, the Israelites are the children of Yahweh, using kind of a similar designation. So there might be a way that how a regional god becomes the ancestor, or vice versa. An ancestral figure becomes the regional god. And this seems to be a possible direction of how a region territory becomes then associated with some sort of patrilineal relation, then to a theophoric designation.
Okay, so you got region, people of the region, then God arguably gets named after that region, and then that god becomes one of many, and then we have a polytheism that eventually moves towards henotheism or monolatry, where you have one god that exists among many. You still believe that all these other gods exist, but here, for the people of Yahweh, Yahweh was our god. He was the main god, battling out with these other gods. They all exist, but here's my main one. And then that moves to, actually, he's the only one, and all of these other gods now fail to exist. That Mesha stele, what was the dating of that?
That's in the 10th century, somewhere in the 900s. And it also helps date itself because it talks about Mesha fighting the Omri dynasty, the first dynasty from the Northern Kingdom.
So would it be fair to say that is a Mesha stele the first extant evidence of God belief, or of the is it first reference to the God of Yahweh?
Yes. The 9th century is the earliest confirmed source of evidence of any way that the word or name Yahweh is being used as a god name. It's also the oldest references to the god name actually being used to people's names. So I'm talking to Jonathan, which is Yonatan, which is literally gift of God, gift of Yahweh. Names like that, the oldest ones we can find are also from the 9th century. So somewhere between the 12th century and the 9th century, Yahweh goes from territorial designation, according to Egyptian records, to local god name based on both theophoric names and the Mesha stele. So in those few centuries, there's a transition.
There's a commenter on the live chat here, Slim Chipley, that says, when you put Judaism and Christianity in the same mythological world as the rest of the Mediterranean world, it becomes so much more interesting to me. This is something that I really feel that people might think that historically grounding, or not even grounding, historically explaining the Bible and seeing it in the context of the ancient Near East, I think gives it a much greater magnificence. I think to understand in its true context opens our eyes to the beauty of anthropology and just the evolution of ideas and culture. I just think it makes it for a really rich tapestry that you don't quite get when you extract the Bible. I wrote a chapter on the ancient Near Eastern legal codes and how the covenant code and holiness code, you got all these, and the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, all these legal codes, which I think is actually the core kind of remit of the Torah, really. The Hebrew Bible and then the Christian Bible, I think here's your core initially. But actually, for the Orthodox Jew and Christian, you are extracting this out of the evolution of all these other legal codes in the area that explain how these particular legal codes came to be, and you extracting it from that context, and then you're treating it as a standalone asserted truth, which I think does such injustice to the beauty of the tapestry of the entire region and the history thereof. So yeah, I really appreciate that comment. Anyway, sorry, it was just a bit of a sidebar there. So
it's an awesome sidebar.
So we have Yahweh starting to come to the fore in a time that is after the claimed dating for the Exodus story, and of course within the
Yes.
story of Exodus we have the interaction of the Egyptian people with Yahweh supposedly, whereby he kills all the firstborn, all the cattle, kills the Egyptian soldiers in the Red Sea or Reed Sea or whatever. We have all of this opportunity for the people of Egypt to fully come to believe in Yahweh as like he does that to show strength. I mean, he admits it in the text of Exodus. Much of what he's doing there is to show that he is supreme and supremely powerful. Now, if that really happened, you would expect all the Egyptian people to go, well, yeah, Yahweh exists because he's just proved it to us, because he's wrought destruction right across, and it's very explicit in the text, right across Egypt. Every firstborn, cattle dead, crops dead, the Nile turned to blood, gnats, boils, etc., etc., etc. Like, to then have that happen and then go, what we would expect is there to be huge amounts of evidence for Yahweh, because the people have interacted with Yahweh, they've seen how powerful he is. You would expect them to then go, so therefore that's the God we need to believe in, because he's just crapped all over the existing gods we've got that didn't do anything to save us. But we hear nothing at all. There's nothing at all heard about kind of Judaism or Yahwism up until 1,000 years later, really, when you start getting, as in believers inside Egypt, when you start getting diaspora communities setting up in Egypt. Is just incredible. Anyway, another sidebar.
Yeah, and I guess to put it in like a modern analogy, imagine that we are future historians and the people of the world believe in the god Oklahoma. And we then, of course, start doing some digging. You realize, actually, thousands of years ago, Oklahoma was a, relatively small regional designation in the mid-U.S. that wasn't, all that particularly powerful economically or socially. And then somehow, because of a breakaway group of people there that started worshipping a local deity, and then by a whole bunch of circumstance that one of their offshoots then became connected to the later world empire and spread that religion throughout. Now everyone around the world worships the almighty god Oklahoma. That is kind of what would have happened analogously with Yahweh as the god of Israel, but originally just being some sort of regional territory name. And then a bunch of stuff happens, and then Christianity pops up and then gets integrated later with the Roman Empire, spreads it around the world, and now all of a sudden everyone knows the name, or kind of knows the name, Yahweh. And I say kind of knows because there is one caveat worth knowing. We aren't 100% sure how to pronounce the name because the vowel pointing in the text is actually wrong on purpose. If you take the 4 letters that make up the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, the vowel points there actually don't match what you would expect. It looks actually like the Masoretes who did this pointing used the vowel points for the designation of Lord, Adonai. So if you take the vowel sounds of Adonai, force it into YHWH, you get Yahovah, which then becomes ultimately Jehovah in bastardized English.
Yeah. Yeshua. Yeah. So we then get onto this interesting idea of internal evidence, or indeed evidence against kind of Yahweh existing as a single supreme God, as monotheists would have it be, looking back into the Bible. So actually the Bible, and I love the idea that it was what's his first name? I just watched a video with him, Sledge.
Justin Sledge.
Justin Sledge, just saying, many people incorrectly see the Bible as a book, whereas it's actually a library. So the Bible is a library, and it is just a whole bunch of texts that have been somewhat cobbled together, and it includes very old text in there, in the same way that, if we wrote a book now analogous to the Bible, that book that we wrote now would also include English that was Chaucerian English, Shakespearean English, and there would be elements of that we couldn't read. But because we read the Bible in English, like it gets rid of all of those problems for us. But the original text, as far as we understand it, the extant texts of these different books within this library that is the Bible show us, different ideas of maybe what Yahweh was and how Yahweh sat amongst many gods, and that in fact there was polytheistic beliefs in here when you look at the oldest language excerpts from the Bible. But talk to us a little bit about this idea that within the Bible we can see multiple gods, that who is El, who is Baal, is there evidence of Asherah in both the Bible and also maybe amongst archaeological finds? Like, talk to us about this.
Well, how about I take you to what is often considered one of the oldest pieces of the Hebrew Bible. There are several songs in the Bible: the Song of Deborah, the Song of the Sea, the Song of Moses. You will have arguments about whether these are actually old or they're actually archaicizing, but generally one
Can you
of
explain
the
what
texts that's...
archaicizing means?
Oh, yes. Basically, writing in such a way to sound old. So if I try to sound Shakespearean, and of course, I can add these and thous to my speech. Me sprecketh shitfully. That's Shakespearean, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Obviously, I am not practicing it. Those who actually try to mimic Shakespeare can do a good job. I cannot. But the idea, if I try to sound older, I actually then sound more authoritative, sound more of a time that we might give great respect to because of its antiquity. The Greeks did that. They were trying to archaicize and sound more Homeric. And it's possible that some of our Hebrew texts do that. But nonetheless, one of the texts that most Bible scholars will consider one of the oldest pieces of the Bible is in the book of Deuteronomy, and not because Moses wrote it. This, again, looks like some sort of extra inclusion, and this is in chapter 32 of the book of Deuteronomy. This is the Song of Moses. And it's also one of the last speeches Moses gives before he goes and, stops living after about 120 years. In this song, it shows its antiquity. In fact, not only is it written in a style that looks ancient, but it even talks about, it's saying the stories I'm about to tell you are old as well. So it's saying I'm old, and this is even older. So let me just read a couple of verses. Again, this is from Deuteronomy 32. I'm going to start from verse 7. Remember the days of old, consider the years long past. Ask your fathers, and he will inform you. Your elders, they will tell you. So already in verse 7, what I'm telling you is already old. And this is in this old song. So this is at least indicating we should believe this is antique. So now verse 8. When the Most High apportioned the nations, when he fixed humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the people according to the number of the gods. The Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. Now, that is from the NRSV UE, and it has a few different footnotes because you're going to notice a few things different between this, your King James Version, and there are some interesting manuscript problems because this text later became a problem for everybody. Now, here's the main thing. When it says the Most High, it is not Yahweh. It is not Adonai. It is the Hebrew Elyon, basically the God, the big guy. And so it's saying, when Elyon apportioned the nations, he divided up humankind, fixed the boundaries of the people according to the numbers of the gods, and Yahweh's portion was his people, Jacob, his allotted share. This is saying Elyon and Yahweh are two different gods. There's a whole bunch of other gods. Each nation has a god, and Yahweh is a regional deity, and he gets Palestine or Canaan because of his inheritance of the people of Jacob, his inheritance. In other words, Elyon is his father, and this is the portion that he gets. This is not what you would expect from monotheism, that there's only one God. It doesn't even fit well on henotheism, that Yahweh is the top God. This is just one member of the pantheon who is lower down on the pecking order, who gets the one part of the Middle East without the oil.
It's flat out polytheism, and it's polytheism that's evidenced within the Bible, right? And this, biblical conservatives will spend an awful lot of time and effort trying to harmonize this, but it doesn't really do justice to the fact that
Yeah.
that this is very clear evidence of polytheism, and that the El, and then what you then see throughout other biblical texts, this is not the only excerpt. I don't know if you're going to read some more, but you've got Council of Gods and all sorts of different references, but then you start seeing this evolution of Yahweh taking on really El, taking on the kind of the bearded father figure style of God. But then you have his, I guess, I don't know if nemesis is the right idea, but his challenger maybe, or another similar combat storm god in Baal. We see evidence of Baal, like Jezebel, for example, the name in the Bible, the bell bit at the end there being reference to Baal, and so there's lots of reference. In fact, there are images of Yahweh as a bull, are there not, in temple imagery? I think the northern Israelites were had less of a problem with seeing Yahweh in a kind of bullish nature, should we say. So you then see Yahweh take on these elements of these other gods and subsume them and integrate all of those characteristics into Yahweh. Is that fair?
Yeah. We don't actually even get like the anti-icon movements against like depicting Yahweh until also much later. So there is a famous bit of let me bring this up on my computer just so we can see it. Let me try to embiggen this.
Of course, so many people have issues with this because this is very uncomfortable for, the idea that Yahweh was the supreme and only God eternally, causally prior to the creation of the universe. Instead, we have a parochial God who is a member of a pantheon.
And when we say pantheon, this is, I believe, 7th or 8th century leftover bit of pottery with some drawing on here. And this is when you try to extract out the image better, and the writing on here. And it talks about here on the left, this big guy is Yahweh. It tells us up here. And we can tell he's a man because of this.
Yeah.
And to the right, it's yeah. But this says this is basically like to Yahweh and his Asherah. Basically, Asherah is the wife for Yahweh here. So he's got some interesting headdress. He's Donald Ducking it, apparently, if you're familiar with that terminology. Perhaps not. Oh, Donald Ducking it. That is wearing a shirt but no pants, like Donald Duck in the cartoons.
Right. Okay. Yes.
And so very masculine, very much trying to show, look how manly I am. Look at my hot wife. And apparently these folks had no problem depicting God. They apparently don't remember that commandment about not depicting, making graven images or anything like that. It's almost like the law didn't exist yet.
Yes. So this is where we start understanding that, and we're not going to go into the details of this, but as we've been writing in our book, the orthodoxy, for want of a better word, it's probably not quite the right word, but the kind of, let's just say orthodoxy of Judaism as we come to later understand it, was not established at this point, certainly at this point. In fact, I guess we can quickly dip into the Elephantine papyri here, because they also give us an understanding that Jewish people at the time, or not at the time, earlier than one might think, and also later than one might think, didn't have a notion of the temple in Jerusalem being the only temple, that didn't have a notion of monotheism, and this was, at a time where supposedly this is like maybe even almost 1,000 years after the Exodus story is supposed to have taken place. This is a good time to talk about the Elephantine papyri.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to talk about, yeah, we'll talk about Elephantine, and I'll also bring up one other observation about the textual tradition of Deuteronomy 32, because they
Yes.
have at least a little bit of connection here. So the Elephantine papyri, this is a collection of ostraca, other bits of writing, scraps of writing, all coming from this region in southern Egypt. Elephantine, this little like territory right on the uh, southern parts of the Nile River, that was also a military outpost to protect the southern portions of Egypt. During a good chunk of time in the fifth century, Egypt was controlled by the Persians, and the Persians had all sorts of mercenaries that they would have and pay out to say, all right, you guard this territory while we go and do our Persian stuff over here. And I'm pretty sure they refer to it as just Persian stuff. My
Clear.
my my Persian is not that great, so I don't know the terms very well there. Nonetheless, in Elephantine, we have a bunch of different groups down there, and one of the groups we know about there were Jews. And we have a bunch of mentions of them, writings from them, letters from them, or it also letters about them, letters to them, ostraca left by them, that gives us a surprisingly good picture of what life was like in this
Mm.
region for this group of people here. And among the things we are told, they did worship Yahweh. Yahweh was one of the gods they worshipped, along with several other gods with El designations, so other Semitic gods that they also prayed to, worshipped, paid tithes to. And, once you're paying money, I think that's when you could say, yep, this is definitely a god you worship. Once it costs shekels, then yes, okay, clearly you care. There was a temple to Yahweh there. This is mentioned multiple times. One of the ostraca as well has been looked at and realized, oh, this depicts rituals within the temple, cursing rituals within the temple, being led by a priestess. So this is also a little
So all of this
unorthodox.
shouldn't exist if we retroject our later understanding of Orthodox Judaism back in time. Like, you shouldn't have this other temple. You certainly shouldn't have rituals, cursing rituals involving a female priestess. That you certainly shouldn't be believing in and paying tithes to other gods.
Yes. And we also can't just say, well, these were just bad Jews or something like that. Like, first off, come on, that's obviously both theologically charged, it's ethically charged, it's not even a good way to depict
Mm.
things. But if we want to say, are these people unusual or are they the norm? There's a few things that we can do to check that. So, first off, are these people so isolated from the rest of Judaism that they've just gone off and done their own thing? But the thing is, we also see that they were actually in communication with the central cult in Jerusalem. So when the temple at Elephantine was destroyed by a fire, they actually wrote to Jerusalem to say, hey, can we get some funds to help rebuild it? And I think here's a good way to think of this. Here in the US, the drinking age is 21. So, in theory, if you're under the age of 21, you can't buy alcohol. Only if you don't know about this law would you be a 19-year-old trying to get alcohol. And even worse, if you went up to a police officer and say, hey, could you buy me some beer at the 7-Eleven here? This is basically what the Jews at Elephantine are doing. They are going to the police officer asking to buy beer even though they're 19. The only reason you would do that is you don't even have the concept that there's something wrong with this. And we don't have a response from the central authorities at Jerusalem, but we don't have anything that just tells them, hey, you clearly have no idea what the hell you're doing. We have no indication that they are being the outsiders, and they don't see themselves as anything weird if they are chatting up the central authority saying, hey, we want to, continue doing proper worship down here, or what they think is proper worship with a temple. That centralization just isn't even an awareness they have in the late 5th century, the late 400s BC.
And isn't there also evidence of other diaspora Jewish communities having this kind of is in Greece? I seem to remember
Yeah. In
having
Greece,
some.
in Babylon, in Greece, there's actually this inscription from the 4th century BC where a Jew, I forget what his name is, but he in this inscription says that he is a Jew, and he says he set up this monument to this god with a Greek name that he was visited by in a dream to do these things. So literally, a Jew living in Greece writing inscriptions thanking a Greek god for some good omens. So Yeah, that's definitely unusual. In Babylon, there doesn't seem to be evidence of awareness of centralized worship, needing to take care of Sabbaths, things like that. We also have in the 4th century, 3rd century, outside Greek sources talking about people living in Syria and Palestine, talking about the traditions there, and talking about all these things that the people are doing there that don't follow what we would consider kosher laws. Star worship, sacrifices that don't fit things, a whole bunch of stuff that, again, you go through the prophets, you go through the Torah, these are all supposed to be no-nos, but we have these outsiders saying, these are what the people are just normally doing. We have coins from Palestine as well that show images of gods, including of Yahweh. So again, we don't see this designation of, hey, no graven images over and over and over again. The people in Elephantine are not unusual. They are the norm. Whoever wrote the Bible, those are the weirdos.
So that this is really, really important. I think the Elephantine papyri are one of the most significant finds, really, in the analysis of the evolution of God belief in the area and biblical exegesis. I mean, I don't know if this person in live chat, I don't really need to give them too much time, but just Gustav Key Eve says fake news. Now, if this is just a dismissal of what we're saying as being fake, that's not good enough. You've got to substantiate your claims like we are doing. This is really, really established archaeology, what we're saying. Like, no one debates the Elephantine papyri's existence or what they say. Right? It's clear they say this. This is not like interpretation. This is what they show. Now, the question for the believer is, how do you fit that in with the idea that, well, according to our beliefs, the Bible has set out that the single monotheistic belief was well established almost 1,000 years before this, and that we had the events of the Exodus and so on and so forth, and none of this. So what's really interesting about the Elephantine papyri, of course, is what they don't mention as well, Aaron. So is it worth bringing that to bear here?
Yeah. Not only what they contain is unexpected, but what they don't contain is unexpected. So is there anything in these papyri that show any awareness of an Exodus tradition? No, there doesn't seem to be any awareness of that. Does it talk about the various patriarchs of Judaism? Any Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Nothing that we see being mentioned there. No great acclaim for King David. Definitely no Moses. All those grand figures from the Old Testament just don't seem to be on the radar as the sorts of things that they care about, talk about, celebrate. Now, there is one thing that might be the exception. There is a papyri that's sometimes called the Passover document. But the weird thing is, while it's been translated and talking about the Passover in that the dates that the document describes definitely puts it at Passover time, but the word Passover itself doesn't exist there. That's an inclusion by the interpreter where there are holes in the text and saying, well, this is where the word Passover should go. And it's been recently suggested, actually, this looks like this is reifying a Persian springtime festival. And this might actually even be the origins of Passover, combining it with a earlier Persian/Zoroastrian tradition here. So if anything, once again, what people will point to as evidence for the Bible ends up, once you actually take off the Bible-colored glasses, you realize, oh, in its actual context, when you actually look at primary evidence, this looks more like evolution of traditions, incorporation of outside influences on formative Judaism.
Yeah, it's syncretism to a large degree, where you're taking existing rituals or celebrations and then you renaming it in for example, the festival of the unleavened bread and Passover, supposedly being pre-existing celebrations. Same with kind of Easter. The word Easter comes from Oestre, does it not? A god that exists well outside the pantheon of the ancient Near East. So Christianity has a habit of going around the world and assimilating certainly chronology, dates, times in the calendar, and putting it to the use of their own ends. But yeah, so the Elephantine papyri and all of this other evidence points to this idea that actually there was no great knowledge of the key, the foundation of the Bible, really, of the Hebrew Bible. So we don't really see mention of the founding fathers, of Moses, until very late. We're looking in the Bible to see what the earliest evidence of the mention of Moses was in there, and like, are they earlier parts of the text, and on that. But our general thesis is that most of these stories were written far later. Maybe there'll be some existing pre-exilic period. So this is when the Jewish people were exiled in Babylonia. And then you have the exilic period when they're in exile, not all of them, but many of them, and then post-exilic. And actually, there's a lot of writing of the Bible that as we are, I think, understanding more and more in recent times, that was done post-exilic, which is really very late.
Oh yes, and not only that, but also don't forget the edits, because I want to turn back to something interesting in Deuteronomy 32 before it's forgotten. Yeah. Now, I mentioned in verse 9 for Deuteronomy 32, it says that, verse 8, that the God Most High, Elyon, apportioned the nations, fixed boundaries to the people according to the number of gods. And I'm highlighting the word gods there because if you are looking at your Hebrew Bible based on the Masoretic text, the Leningrad Codex, and you open that up, it does not say gods, it does not say Elohim, it will say something else. Instead, it will talk about the children of Israel. So the number of nations will be the same as the number of children of Israel. That's a little bit weird. And if you go to the Greek, it will talk about the number of angels. Something weird is happening. But if you go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it actually holds this older reading. And there are some variants of the Septuagint, the Greek translation, that also seem to indicate that it originally did say children of God, the sons of God. And that was deliberately changed in the Hebrew to better conform with the growths in monotheism. So this ancient poem about Yahweh inheriting his people was becoming problematic, and it was deliberately changed. We have the textual evidence that shows that. So this is again showing how much the religion changed, and it wasn't just Moses passed this on and we have a copy of it now. It's no, we have these long, complex textual traditions, and as theologies developed, they went back, reinterpreted things, and sometimes pulled out the big eraser and fixed things as needed.
Yeah, interesting. So to go back to, as we kind of finish off the idea of Yahweh developing, and good to have Derek Lambert from Myth Vision popping in. Good morning, gents, he says. So we have, you've talked about Yahweh and Asherah. We've understood now that Yahweh was not originally the God of Israelites, but it was a deity among many in possibly Canaanite pantheon. The Tel Dan stela and other inscriptions show that Israel and Judah worship multiple deities, with exclusive Yahwism developing only gradually. Yahweh's origins appear to be southern, associated with the region of Seir, Edom, Midian, but not Egypt. What does the Bible tell us about Yahweh's origins in the south? Is there any light you can shine on that?
Yeah, so this is part of something that's often called the Midianite hypothesis. Sometimes it goes by slightly different names, but the idea that, hey, there are these things in the Bible that suggest that God is actually coming from the south and then coming and doing things. But the suggestion is, if God is coming from the south, that might be originally where his cult developed, in what would be Edomite, Moabite, or southern kind of territories there. While possible, there's a few things. It's interesting that some more evangelical sources will use this to talk about where God comes from and also explain why Moses found God in Midianite territory when he had his first encounter with Yahweh at the burning bush. But also the people who argue this from internal evidence from the Bible are using the documentary hypothesis. So it's a bit interesting when evangelicals try to point to the Midianite hypothesis to bolster the biblical claims about where Yahweh comes from and already being worshipped down there, without realizing, oh, this hypothesis depends on the documentary hypothesis, meaning Moses didn't write this crap.
So just for those who don't know, but I'm sure many will, the documentary hypothesis sets out that, well, first of all, Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, because there are multiple sources. Moses can't write about his own death. Moses talk about being the most humble man in the land or whatever, which is rather weird for someone who's supposedly so humble to write that about themselves. So anyway, there's lots of evidence that there are multiple sources, and in fact, you get redundancy. So repetition, redundancies, stuff that ends up being in the text that's repeated. You don't need it there. There's contradictions. There's all sorts of these different elements that very much show that the early books of the Bible are written by combining multiple sources together, sometimes known as J, E, D, and P, but there are different versions of that, and you get supplementary hypothesis, but it doesn't matter what you really believe. I mean, the key finding here is that there were definitely multiple sources. It definitely wasn't written by one person. Then you got the editors, as you've already referenced. So for these biblical traditionalists to say, well, we're going to rely on something called the Midianite hypothesis, which itself is contingent upon the idea that there are multiple sources, they are already accepting that Moses wasn't a single author of the Bible.
Yeah. Now, I should also note that I'm not persuaded by the Midianite hypothesis. I think there's actually a logical issue with that when you say, well, the Bible depicts God from coming this region, therefore that's where the cult starts. I can do a kind of a reducto ad absurdum. The god Poseidon lives in the sea. Did the cult of Poseidon begin underwater? Probably not. So that sort of thing doesn't sound persuasive. And there's also other depictions, sometimes God coming from northern regions. It's basically God comes from like some place that's far away, and then he comes swooping in to do God stuff. That doesn't mean that's where the cult itself necessarily begins. So I think there's not a strong logic to persuade me in that direction. And also combined with the Shasu Yahweh thing, that doesn't seem to connect necessarily to anything with Midianite territory. I'm not currently persuaded by that approach.
Yeah, and so what we tend to see is this development of monotheism or Yahwism, probably in the 7th to 6th century BC. What the reforms that took place, and then you've got the Babylonian exile. So do you want to give us a little context of both those things and how that might have affected the development of the idea of Yahweh and Yahwism?
Yeah. So there's a few historical things that are at least important to have as landmarks for where the development would exist. So first off, we have, starting again the 9th century, our earliest confirmation of Yahweh as a name of a god found from the Mesha Stele, where another god kicks Yahweh's butt, which shows very regional, or how regional Yahweh was, which also becomes an interesting thing. If Yahweh can't even defeat a deity that's his neighbor, how does he go into Egypt and start kicking ass and taking names? But I'll leave that aside for now.
Yeah, this is evidence of the internal problems with the Bible. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, the Bible itself doesn't do modern traditionalists favors in establishing a very clear sense that God was all powerful, all knowing, and all loving, not in any way, shape, or form. That's a philosophical invention that comes later.
Yes. So I should also note that the Mesha Stele, we also have the Israelite side of the story in 2 Kings, I think. So there's this battle between the Israelites and the Moabites, and we basically get both sides of that story, and the Hebrew text kind of yada yadas over Yahweh losing. It says like a great fury was raised against the people after the king of the Moabites, Chemosh, apparently sacrificed his own son to Chemosh to basically get some extra juju to win on the battlefield. And that apparently turned the tides, because the biblical text is saying the Israelites were winning, they were about to win, and then King Mesha sacrifices his son to Chemosh, and that apparently turns the tides. That's at least what it looks like when we piece things together, like how the narrative is going about. And considering the Moabites say we won, and the Israelites say we left because fury was raised against us, you put 2 and 2 together, oh, Yahweh lost. Wah, wah.
Yeah, the Bible literally admits that Yahweh lost. Pretty
Yes.
incredible. And I just want to, like, I know I shouldn't really respond to live chatters who aren't worth the time of day. Knight of Kadosh here says the only consistent thing about the atheist position is how reliably they embarrass themselves by failing to defend it. It's really interesting because we literally just written a 450-page book painstakingly going through the evidence, where he says nothing is more humiliating than boldly asserting your worldview. I'm not sure we're asserting a worldview here, by the way, is rational than proving in real time you can't defend a single part of it. We are literally like establishing stuff with evidence, internal and external evidence. So like that is a flyby troll comment. Please don't put troll comments. Only put things that you can substantiate. If you can't substantiate what you're saying, don't bother commenting at all because it's worthless. Anyway, sorry.
I also have to note that the image he has for himself in that comment, it's from I believe 19th century painting, and the first time I saw that painting, it was used as the cover image for Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. So when I see that, I see atheist art. So irony of the image choice.
Yeah, the Knight of Kadosh heralding atheist art. So well done. Yes. Look, so we have this situation whereby I don't know if I interrupted you though. We're establishing. Sorry,
I'll just quickly jump through. So 9th century, we have confirmation that Yahweh is a god, a regional deity, gets in fights with other deities. Doesn't necessarily show great power. Now, later on, we have developments within the Holy Land. In particular, there's a few things that happen. You originally have these two kingdoms that we can confirm, which we just call the northern and southern kingdoms of the territory of Canaan. The northern kingdom is usually the more powerful one, the more economically prosperous for a long time. And it falls in the 720s with the new rising Assyrian or Neo-Assyrian Empire comes in and ultimately destroys the northern kingdom. Lots of folks then flee to the south. The southern kingdom barely holds on against the Assyrian onslaught, in part because the king there pays a bribe to keep himself safe. And from that point, the southern kingdom continues to exist.
Sorry, this is also really important because you get an influx of people from the north to the south, don't you?
Yes.
With their own sort of beliefs of Yahweh that are somewhat different to the southern beliefs of Yahweh. And there is some interesting analysis that can be done to kind of understand, these influences that come down through the assimilation of these peoples. Anyway, carry on.
Yes. And also when the Assyrians are coming in and they're wrecking stuff, this also erects a bunch of the other holy sites, which also might be part of the reason there's a centralization of the Yahweh cult, because many of the other cultic sites had been destroyed by an incoming army. So whether this is because the Israelites are trying to go monotheistic or the other cultic sites are being wrecked by an outside force, the evidence is a little bit ambiguous at this point. But nonetheless, during the time of Hezekiah, at least according to the biblical tradition, there is now more centralization of the Yahweh cult. And, of course, how much of this is true, we can tell. It's hard to say because we don't have enough outside sources. But still, if we go by the biblical narrative, this is an important point where in the southern kingdom, Yahweh is becoming extra important as there are reforms and centralization of the cult. Later on, the southern kingdom itself falls with the ascending Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is able to knock out the Assyrians completely. And then with the coming of King Nebuchadnezzar, he then conquers a lot of territory, including, of course, all of the Holy Land. There are several invasions of Canaan, the destruction of the monarchy, and then later in the 580s BCE, the destruction of the temple of God, which then becomes this huge inflection point in the Jewish religion, because now with the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the land, complete foreign occupation, how will the people group survive as a unified entity? What will happen to the religious organizations as people are being taken off into exile? It is a rough time, and you can see that in some of the songs, the psalms that were written in this time period, showing just how distraught everyone is and how can you continue to worship God in a foreign land, which should also be an interesting thing. Hey, worshiping Yahweh apparently is only possible when you are on Yahweh's territory. So like this is one of the songs of lament. How will we worship him in a foreign land? This only becomes a problem if you don't think that's actually something you could possibly do. So a transition has to happen in Judaism. We see it in like prophets like Ezekiel, where God will literally put on a set of wheels so he can get around. The chariot of God that you see in Ezekiel's visions. This is actually literally trying to show, all right, God is getting a cool ass motorcycle. He's going through his midlife crisis, so he can, show he's the cool guy, and coming around and showing, no, I'm still here with you. Check out my ride. And eventually, the exile ends.
Yeah, and then prior to this as well, you get the assimilation of Baal into Yahweh. And there's some really interesting references to kind of storm god combats. You've got snakes, leviathans, behemoths, so on and so forth. Like, what can you tell us about Baal in the context of Yahweh?
Yeah. So Baal is just a general designation for a god that is important. It literally just basically means like Lord, similar to like Adonai is Lord. So when you sing these Baals, it's really more of a title than an actual name. It gets somewhat conflated later on to becoming almost a general name. Funny enough, you could say the same thing for Zeus. Zeus in Proto-Indo-European goes back to Zeus, and it's just like a word for a deity. So when you see the name Zeus, it's basically like saying the name of the god is God. In the same way, like Allah is the god, same sort of thing there. So this is kind of happening to Baal, going from like a title to a more proper name through transitional forms along the way. Either way, Baal becomes this designation for all sorts of other gods that Yahweh is then supposed to be in competition with. Famously, there is Baal figures from Ugaritic, and a lot of Ugaritic mythology we also see kind of repeated and modified in early Israelite stories. The probably most important thing that we have from there is indeed the combat myth, where the world is created by having the storm god fighting some sort of dragon or multi-headed serpent. Funny enough, we find this in Syrian texts, we find this in Babylonian texts, we have it far away. We actually see that it has traveled all the way to Japan. Early Japanese myth also has their storm god Sunusu defeating an eight-tailed beast called Yamato Narochi, and is also believed to come from this same ancient Ugaritic Syrian myth. So if it traveled all the way from Syria to Japan, it could travel from Syria to Palestine. All right, yeah. Distance is not the problem at that point. And we have all sorts of like hints throughout the Old Testament that, yeah, there is still this memory of God fighting a sea beastie, or as I like to say in the book, a kaiju.
Which is reference to Godzilla.
Yes. Godzilla, and also then the recognition that, yeah, the Japanese version of a storm god fighting a dragon, well, we're seeing the same thing here. I see kaiju everywhere. And yes, this Japanese story has been turned into films by Toho Studios already, like back in the 50s or 60s. They have already done their own version of the storm god fighting the eight-headed dragon. And Toho is the studio that produces Godzilla. So yes, it is fair to call it a kaiju at this point.
So this is really interesting. So there is definite internal biblical evidence that that polytheism, that other gods existed, as we see the mythology of Baal get integrated into the existence of Yahweh, where he is, Yahweh is essentially another storm god, and hey, this neighborhood ain't big enough for the both of us.
Right. We see that clearly, for example, in Habakkuk, where God is riding around in a chariot with spears and other weapons to fight, and fight nations or fight monsters. We have all this other imagery of using the imagery of like dragons that God fights to either defeat other nations or to create the world. So specifically in the chaos or the creation by combat myth that we see in a bunch of ancient Near Eastern sources, including Babylonian, the chief god comes in, the storm god comes in, kills the big monster and rips apart its body to become the heaven and the earth. And then this division is how we get everything. And we see the same sort of imagery being abstracted into what we find in Genesis 1. When God began to create the world, the word for create, bara, is actually talking about separating. So it also seems to be taking those original ideas of separating out the parts of the body of the giant sea monster to create the world, but now it's being abstracted and philosophized by the priestly author of Genesis 1. So even more development. We can see the hints of the old history in that creation account. So Genesis 1 was not the first thing that Moses penned. It is probably a rather late version part of the Pentateuch, where the priestly author is already taking this older myth that has already gone through its own centuries of tradition changes and then being adjusted and philosophized to becoming just this spirit over the water dividing things, rather than God, punching a monster in the face until it gives up.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, this is where you when you read the Bible, it's kind of referring back to Slim Chipley's comment earlier in the video. When you read the Bible with your eyes open, trying to understand how everything got here, got to be where it is, it becomes so much more interesting, rather than starting with the assertion that this is all historically true and it is all taken out of the context of the ancient Near East. It's just this truth that exists unconnected to anything around it, and that just does such disservice to what's really going on here. It's so much more interesting to understand. So they've taken this element of that mythology over to here. Those legal codes have their basis in the Lipa Ishtar or Uranumu, or Code of Hammurabi over there, or the Hittite codes over there. That's how they've evolved. Or we can see the relevance there by what they've changed, not by what they've kept in, and so on and so forth. And it just becomes a much, I think, richer tapestry, like I've said. So what else is there to say about the sort of evolution of Yahweh as an idea, as a belief, that you don't think you've touched on yet?
So it's interesting that Yahweh goes from a local deity who is given a designation of where he gets to rule, and when he tries stepping out of his territory, he is not successful, to later becoming the God to rule all nations, including being able to go into other nations to take his people out by force, and does so successfully. That is a theological change, and it only makes sense if that change has happened over time, rather than somehow God was able to create the entire universe before even existing before time, and no, I will not even try to explain that sentence, to being able to completely defeat the Egyptians, take his people out with great and powerful miracles, and then somehow in the 9th century, people barely even know what his name is, and he can't even defeat the local Moabite deity that isn't supposed to even exist because there's only one deity in the entire universe. That is weird if you think monotheism is obviously true. Instead, it is change over time, an evolution of a local patron deity to becoming somehow slowly the God of everyone and everything.
So so there's a very truncated and succinct synopsis of the evolution of Yahweh, and to establish that really this certainly an orthodox, but even an existing belief in Yahweh was not evident at the time of the supposed time of the Exodus accounts, right? So already the Exodus accounts don't work, because the proposed time, either the Bible is just outright wrong in its claims, in which case it all falls apart. It's like a house of cards. Well, what can we believe in the Bible? If it's got it wrong about this, and this, and establishing when the Exodus took place, if we can show that is impossible, then how do we justify believing any of it? But anyway, let's just carry on. So already it's broken, but we've got the story of Exodus still. What about, let's move past Yahweh and talk about, say, Israel, or the tribes of Israel, or the founding fathers. And this is where we need to kind of have a little understanding of Abraham and Jacob and then Moses. So we got the 12 tribes. Our received understanding from the Bible is that you then had these Hebrew people coming outside of coming out of bondage from within Egypt, which we've already established in prior videos. There's absolutely no evidence of this, no evidence whatsoever. Go and watch previous videos on this topic. We're not going to revisit that. So there's no evidence of what happened inside Egypt at all. But anyway, the Bible claims they came out of Egypt, spent 40 years in Kadesh Barnea or in the wilderness. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, when there should be evidence of that. Then they cross the Jordan, then they go into Canaan and actually, have destroy cities and essentially take over the area. But then, this understanding of what Israel was and the 12 tribes, also is problematic. Can you give us some more details on that?
Sure. Yeah. So very quickly, the biblical story is Abraham gets a message from God to pick up his stakes and move from pretty much like modern day Iraq, Kuwait, and then come to the promised land in modern day Israel like territory. So Abraham's supposed to come there, moves up there, has his kids, has his son Isaac. Isaac has a kid, has a few kids. Jacob becomes the most important for this story, and from Jacob has a lot of kids because he does a bunch of work to get a wife, gets tricked about which wife he gets, and then keeps working to get a second wife. And these two wives are also getting competitive, so they bring in their handmaids, so that way Jacob tries to have as many kids as possible. Families were different back then, apparently. And in this story, we get Jacob having 12 sons who then become the designations of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob has his name changed to Israel by God in a wrestling match. No, I can't explain that either, but that's the story. Jacob has a wrestling match with God, apparently is able to hold his own against the Almighty, and because he wrestled with God, gets the name of Israel. So the sons of Jacob / Israel then become the 12 tribes. And those various kids grow up, and because of some shenanigans with Joseph being forced to go down to Egypt, but then becoming important in Egypt, and then he's able to bring his whole family back into Egypt to keep them safe from a period of famine. So this is how the 12 tribes of Israel then move to Egypt, live there, but then later become enslaved there, and then several centuries have to go until all the people of Israel are able to leave and return to the promised land. That's the basic story and how we integrate Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the enslavement in Egypt, and then finally the exile. So this gives us some predictions. One, there should be some sort of groups of people that would correspond to the tribes that see themselves as part of Israel, as being part of that larger designation. And also, they should be in Egypt during the enslavement, not separate from them. And we should also be able to, find evidence of them picking up stakes, moving to the Holy Land after the Exodus. So, what do we find when we start checking the archaeological record, the historical record, and we start digging through the Bible itself? So, let's remind ourselves that the Exodus is supposed to happen in what's, again, designated as the Late Bronze Age. And this is going to be, very, very roughly 1500 to 1200 BC. Margins are a little bit fuzzy around there, but that's like a general designation when the Late Bronze Age is. And this incorporates pretty much all of the Exodus dates. So what could we go and do as archaeologists to see if this is the case? If there was a giant exodus out of Egypt into Israel, what could we dig for and look for in the Holy Land that would indicate that? My first thought is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are showing up. They're going to, want to have a place to live. So at the very least, we should expect to see a bit of a population boom when all these folks are coming in and taking up space. Well, we can go and do surveys, and there has been decades of work doing this, of literally going around the entirety of the Holy Land, doing surveys to figure out how many settlements there are, getting a general idea of the settlements, and then from there you can figure out at least approximately how many people are living there at a given time. So I'm going to do a quick screen share again. This is going to come from our book. It's a reproduction of a couple different archaeological sources giving counts of sites. And in this graph, what you see here is the number of sites by archaeological period. So starting in Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, Iron 1, Iron 2. The Iron Ages is basically, very roughly the time of like the judges and the first kings of Israel. That's the general time there. Middle Bronze, that's before the Exodus period, and the Late Bronze is when the Exodus is supposed to happen. And you'll notice our different sources, our different authors here of counting up the sites, see that actually it's the population bust during the Late Bronze period. The time when we might expect a huge influx of people to show up is actually when the population is at its lowest in the Holy Land, in the highlands around Canaan, where we might find these people. Instead, we find that this is actually when the land is at its quietest, not its busiest.
So there is no population statistics, population data that supports what the Bible is saying when it says it happened.
Exactly. We see quite the opposite, that we see that during this time, and also the Late Bronze Age, is when Canaan is actually under Egyptian control. And you can see with this population drop from Middle to Late Bronze, the Egyptians are not exactly treating the populace very well. There is this drop off in people living at sites there. So it's not good time to live there. And that doesn't change until after the Egyptians leave in the middle 12th century, which again is after the Israelites are supposed to live there, because according to the Merneptah, there is a people group called Israel living there in 1208 BC, which is still in the Late Bronze period. So Israel is already living here. It's supposed to be living here. And yet we don't see the population boom of a bunch of Israelites showing up one day.
Yeah, and they're supposed to have attacked into Canaan when actually we understand that at that proposed time frame, that would have been under Egyptian control anyway. Like, they were coming out of Egypt technically into Egypt. Like,
yes.
If you are going to be adhering to the biblical chronology as is understood by traditionalists. So there's nothing about the Exodus account that makes any sense, but of known history or internal sort of chronology and history. So, okay, so we have that issue with this area. So how does that pertain to the tribes?
All right. So I'll also show here a map to give a sense of where we ought to be looking. So in the book of Joshua, in the description of the conquest, it also says, here are the territories that are going to go to all the different tribes. All the different ancestors of Jacob are going to go to these various regions. So Judah gets a nice big chunk of territory down here, and Benjamin gets this region, Gad over here, Manasseh, a pretty good chunk, Asher, Naphtali, etc. This is according to the book of Joshua where these designations are. And of course, you can see some of the other kingdoms around, like Moab, Edom, Philistia, and so on. So can we find any evidence on the ground for this?
Sorry, Chelsea went, sorry to interrupt you. Chelsea went says, could you argue it's a story to claim state to a land? Like, it's because I'm looking at that map and thinking that's a really large area. Like, it would be fine if that was completely empty, but that's an area with people in it, right? And then suddenly God just promises that to 12 different tribes. Now, this looks rather like etiology again, which is kind of like a story to explain why different people lived in different areas, right? And retro fitted to reality, or through writing the Bible. But I mean, it seems pretty outrageous that you would say, oh yeah, no, God, the all-loving God said, actually, he is justifying conquest of all of this area for his chosen people, and all the displacement and death and fighting that would come as a result of that.
Yes. All right. And I'm going to just focus on a few of the tribes. I don't want to go through all 12 because I don't have enough coffee. But here's a few things, because interestingly, we have evidence from both Egypt and from the Bible that suggests that this map is very much trying to cover up some problems. So again, key thing is this: all of these tribal regions are supposed to come in with Israel. They should not be here before the Israelites come in. That's the main thing. Right. And we know Israel exists in this region according to the Merneptah, roughly 1208 BC. So let's talk about Asher, because nobody talks about Asher. When I say like the tribes of Asher, this is one of the quote unquote lost tribes, and so everyone just forgets about it, or they relate it to Mormonism. But that's another story. What is interesting about Asher is we do seem to have mention of an Asher in Egyptian text. So in a early 13th century piece of writing, it is mapping out some regions, and it seems to be talking about Tyre or Sidon. It talks about Megiddo in Egyptian, and in between those two spots, it says ISR or Isar, Isher, and it sure looks like the word Asher. And the place it puts it is right between Sidon and Megiddo, which is exactly where Asher is. So it puts it in the right space with the right sort of name as a territory. But it's just that, a territory under Egyptian control at this time. And this is also writing almost a century before the Meneptah. So there seems to be a region called Asher in the Holy Land before the Exodus.
Right. So this again, this shows that the biblical narrative, as established by traditional scholars in terms of its chronology, is wrong.
Yes. And as you can imagine, I'm not the first person to have noticed this. So some of the more evangelical scholars like Kenneth Kitchen tries arguing that Egyptian record can't possibly be about the same Asher from the Bible, tries to find any sort of excuse for that.
Asher.
Yeah. Yeah. This one's wearing a mustache. It's not the same one. No. I'd be only a little facetious there, but it's trying to basically argue like this S, it shouldn't actually be the sh sound, it should be the S sound in this particular case, though they're also having to argue it's a sh sound when it's being used for Moses, but not for Ramses, but yes, for Moses, but not for Asher. It's always changing what it needs to be to fit the biblical story when it needs to. So I find it very unconvincing the way they try to argue around this particular bit of Egyptian writing. When the sound changes as the theory needs it to change, you know it's not evidence driven. So if we go by the evidence,
very ad hoc. Yeah,
exactly. Yes.
So that's Asher.
That's one problem. And let's bring back up the map again. I also want to point out something. So we have the region of Dan and the Danites, and it's also a bit interesting that they have a region here, because if we go north here, there's the town of Dan. Dan. What's going on there? According to the stories from Joshua and Judges, the Danites actually don't ever control this territory. They actually fail to be able to conquer it and control it. And so then they move up to this city, conquer that, and then this becomes their designation. So that's a bit weird that they're saying, Joshua's saying, you're going to go and conquer here. Yay, yay, rah, rah. The Danites fail. They have to move here. Now, there's a few things that are weird. In the Song of Deborah, which again is considered a very ancient piece of Hebrew poetry, it refers to the Danites as people on boats, like they're seafaring people. That's easy to do if they're in the region of Dan right next to Philistia, right there on the Mediterranean Sea. That makes sense if they're boat people there. But here, you're not going to have too many sailors in this little town here. So that's already kind of weird. If you go to the story of the most famous Danite, Samson, he's constantly dealing with the Philistines, which would make sense if he is living in territory next to Philistia, but not if he's all the way up in northern Israelite territory. So there is this confusion. How is it that the Danites are living up here in Dan, but dealing with the Philistines down here? It's almost like, no, they're actually in this territory as expected. So there's contradictory things within the biblical tradition. Also, funny little anachronism as well. If you go to Genesis 14, Abraham is coming in and he's looking for his family, some family members, and he's saying, hey, look as far north as Dan. How could there be a city called Dan if Dan is supposed to be the great-grandson of Abraham, and there's not going to be this Danite territory until even centuries after that, after the Exodus?
So the city of Dan is referenced in the Bible before the existence of the tribe of Dan, of the son.
Exactly.
Of Dan.
So It's all sorts of weird and anachronistic. And that's just one other thing. And one other thing that also makes the Danites a bit interesting and weird. This seafaring aspect to them, the fact they're next to the Philistines, the fact that the name also sounds similar to another group. So in the Egyptian records, there are all these sea peoples. One of them is the Peliset, which is where our word Palestine and Philistia comes from. The same word is in Hebrew. So the Peliset, the Palestinians, the Philistines are mentioned among the sea peoples. There are also the Danuos. Ooh, that sounds close. And in fact, in Greek, an early designation for Greeks is the Danoi. Are the Danites Mediterranean sea peoples? That seems somewhat possible. And also, one other thing. I mentioned Samson is the most famous Danite. And Samson is the big strong guy who goes around and beats up people. He's basically the Jewish Hercules. So, the Jewish Hercules comes from a people group that also seems to be related to these other Aegean peoples. Could there be a leftover of Samson coming from this actually older tradition that ultimately becomes the Hercules stories?
And we won't go into the Samson story being a solar myth. I wrote an essay. I wrote a piece on that once. The evidence is very clear, because actually there's no real theological story or narrative or theology that comes out of the story of Samson and Delilah. It's this weird story, really, that only makes sense actually as a solar myth when you understand that it's a kind of the strength of the sun that then defeated at night by Delilah, who's the darkness night, and then so on and so forth. Strength is in the rays, strength is in the hair. It's a classic solar myth. But anyway, that's by the by.
Yeah. It's still controversial to what extent Samson is solar mythology, but at the very least, his name literally means little sun. So it's begging us to interpret it as solar imagery. And ultimately, what's the origins there? How does it relate to solar myths? Generally, to be continued in another discussion. It's very hard to piece that together. Nonetheless, the Danites are weird in the Bible. The Danites might exist outside of the Bible, and if they do, they actually weren't a tribe of Israel. They weren't a people group originally of the same Semitic peoples, but actually might come from the same regions as the Philistines did, which also explains why they were boat people, why they're on the coastal regions, and why their name sounds very similar to designations given to Greek peoples and also fitting the sea peoples as mentioned by the Egyptians. So none of this is proven. It's very suggestive, and the Bible is already showing, hey, we got mixed traditions about the Danites, and we don't know what the hell we're doing with them.
This is totally left field here, and I'm really sorry. Just very quickly, we mentioned Justin Sledge, and he is a Jewish guy who agrees with all of what we've been saying. So he's like, here is the development of Yahweh, and here is this, and here is that. And he looks at that temple of, is it Josiah's temple that he ripped the temple, knocked the temple down, or anyway, one of the was it Jeconiah? Anyway, one of the temples that you've mentioned, I think, already today, he talks about how that was demolished, and what that meant is the walls fell down on themselves, and in the hot, arid conditions, it was very, very well preserved. And what they found is that all the incense that they were burning inside the temple that coated the walls and got into the cracks, they'd now tested, and they found that they had cannabinoids in them. And he talks about how actually psychedelics and intoxication has a very, very close relationship with religion, early religion particularly. And you can talk about Eucharist now with wine and whatnot, but in more serious kind of like ritualistic, well, that is a ritual, really. It's a wine-based ritual. So how I wonder, says Who's Poppin', how much input psychedelics had on early religion. We know actually that they had an awful lot of impact. There was a place for all sorts of different, even, you can even talk about breathing techniques in, say, Buddhism, I guess, that can give you an altered sense of state. So there is this definite relationship with finding altered sense of states in religion. Sometimes it's kind of looked off as kind of a bit, woo or whatever, but no, it's there. It's very well established indeed.
Yeah, it has been taboo to research this or propose that drugs are a part of religion or religious history. The fact is, it is definitely a part of it, and in some ways, it's also because of what we're willing to even call a drug. We have no problem talking about gods of wine and gods of beer because we don't have a social stigma against wine and beer drinking. But with marijuana, with LSD, things like that, those psychedelics, we consider those as inappropriate kinds of drugs. And so finding any evidence that things like those were used in ancient rituals is now taboo.
And Justin Sledge talked an awful lot about how he's seen a connection between the dreams people were having. Was it in Islam? Or was it was it Zoroastrianism? I don't know. But he was talking about how this was also mapped to the same time that coffee was flooding the kind of area, and actually, people were actually having sort of with a large amount of coffee, were having some kind of hallucinatory, or at least, I don't know, lucid dreaming or whatever it was. Having experiences as a result of this newfound sort of coffee influence. So it's interesting. And you might, like you say, you might not see coffee as a drug, but essentially it is, in certain definitions.
It's a psychoactive substance. It may not be psychoactive in the same way as opiates, but it is a drug in that sort of way. Now, how much can we explain religion as people getting high and having visions? I don't know how much we can possibly determine that, but there is a relationship, and it has to be part of the conversation of understanding the developments people have had. But of course, also, there are ways of quote-unquote getting high or having visions outside of psychedelic drugs. There are breathing exercises and isolation techniques that you can do to also have these sorts of spiritual experiences. I mean, heck, I go running a fair bit. I haven't experienced it, but lots of people talk about a runner's high. So it is possible to make your brain do weird things without chemicals that certain governments around the world try to heavily regulate, if not criminalize.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that's a random aside. So on as far as tribes go, so you've done Asher, Dan. Is there any other tribe that I mean, there are any number you can bring into play?
Let's hit just one more, because this is a good one. Judah. This is probably the most important tribe when it comes to where the Bible comes from, because the ultimate authors or final compilers of the Bible were almost certainly Judeans. And of course, this is where the word Jew and Judaism comes from. And according to Exodus, when it gives us our census or censuses of the people leaving Egypt and coming to the Holy Land, the biggest tribe by a significant margin was Judah. If it's the biggest tribe, then one might wonder, should it have the biggest archaeological presence? So when I mentioned the various surveys that were done around the Canaan to see where sites were, what was the record for Judah? Was it the biggest, middle of the road? Well, we actually find during the Late Bronze Age, the number of settlements in Judah, when I say settlements, so like not people, but like actual settled sites, that number has been determined to be goose egg. So instead of it being the biggest designation, and also Joshua talks about there being like 100 plus cities in Judah alone, instead of there being hundreds of cities, we find no cities, no settlements.
Is this not hill country?
This is part of the hill country. Yes.
Yeah. So you've got this is supposedly like your rural area. I remember reading, and I wrote about this, and I need to find the sources for it again. But the Cain and Abel story, being actually a symbolic story to represent. So one brother gives crops, doesn't he? And the other as an offering, and the other brother gives meat, gives sheep, livestock. And actually, this was to to explain that actually you've got two areas. One is the arable plains and the crops of the low country, and then the high country where you'd graze your sheep. And actually, Cain and Abel is, in some sense, an etiological story, again, to use that term, to explain the two peoples there, and actually that God preferred, I think, the people of the hill country. So it was an establishment of arguably Judah being more pervading more than hill country, or is it something like that. Anyway, I remember reading about that, but you need to go and look at the sourcing for that.
Yeah, plausible hypothesis, but mine is a little bit different in that I think what's actually going on is that Yahweh's original name was not Yahweh but Wendy, and in the beginning was the Baconator.
No, don't do it. Don't do it.
Yeah, you're right. That the Baconator is not kosher, so probably not.
So Judah. So what you're establishing is that the area of Judah, one would expect to be full of people and evidence of those people, archaeologically speaking, given the claims of the Bible through the Exodus, and then the divvying up of this whole area to the 12 tribes, doesn't evidence that at all. The archaeological evidence is non-existent to support the biblical claims of the Exodus story.
Yep. And Judah specifically, it seems like in the late Bronze Age, Judah doesn't even exist. It's not just that it's a small tribe, it's not that it's displaced, it's just it does not exist at all, and we don't see any significant number of settlements until the Iron Age, and even then, Judah is extremely small and weak until basically the destruction of the northern kingdom. Only after that point does the southern kingdom of Judah start become a place of power and significant population because of what happened to the north by other empires. So fundamentally, Judah has done something to increase its own status historically, and part of the explanation is if it was Judeans who wrote big chunks of the Bible and created its history, well, that might explain why all of a sudden that happens. And the last thing I should note here is a lot of the work done about the history of the tribal system and showing that tribes like Judah, Simeon, some of these southern tribes appear to have been actually added into older lists of Israelite tribes. That there are the older designations, so like in the Song of Deborah, it goes through the various tribes and what they did and didn't do in this battle. Judah isn't even mentioned. The Bible doesn't even know about Judah at the time of Deborah. And then these other designations of the tribes.
Northern Israel, that suggests a northern kingdom, like construction of the Bible, or at least those parts of the Bible at that time.
Yeah, that those traditions are older, they're northern, and then they travel south, and then the Judeans incorporate themselves into those stories, sometimes literally adding themselves in awkwardly into these former lists. And we can see that because when we have like these different like blessings of the tribes, a bunch of tribes follow one form, but then like Judah and two other tribes pop in and they are awkwardly placed and they have different formulae for how they're being introduced and blessed. So it's really showing, hey, there's some meshing of things here by some editorial process, which only makes sense if Judah wasn't originally in that list. So archaeologically and biblically, Judah is a latecomer.
It's fascinating. And of course, then we can start talking about the documentary hypothesis again, because actually there's a parallel here with the priestly source being a source that favors Aaron in the or Aaron, depending on how you say it. My cousin, he's called Aaron, spelt the same as you, and so I've always called the name Aaron, but then most people are actually known as Aaron, aren't they? So anyway, there you go. But the P source is a priestly source, writes things in a way that makes Aaron look really, really good. And so you have Moses doing these tricks here, but actually, well, Aaron's pretty strong over here, and that could be argued to be the priestly source getting its wicked way with the text there, right? Because these were priests of the lineage of Aaron, supposedly, that were then coming back and writing these stories that are self-aggrandizing.
Yes. Now, as noted in the comments, the correct original pronunciation is Aaron, and in the story of the golden calf, the correct interpretation or translation, I should say, of when Moses comes down and says, sees what's going on. You done messed up, Aaron. I don't know how much Key and Peele you get in England. So
I have watched Key and Peele on YouTube quite a lot, actually. Not for a good few years, but they had some brilliant sketches. Honestly, some great sketches.
Yeah.
Love
well, this
it.
is the substitute urban school teacher. And let's just say this much. When that skit came out, I was teaching high school. Nice. And my students, see my name and I'm like, yes, we're going to have this game. We're going to have some fun.
Nice. Good stuff. So as we kind of draw this to a close, because we need to look at some of the comments from the last video, we're not going to be looking at how Moses is missing. We might have to do that. Did we not do that in a previous video? Anyway,
we may have quickly talked about it, but yeah, we got a whole chapter about, well, first we got a chapter section saying, hey, where the halibut is Moses? And then a whole chapter about where does Moses actually come from? And as a spoiler, I have talked about this already previously on Myth Vision. Just last week, did a live stream with Derek of Myth Vision fame about a paper I wrote saying, I think I know where Moses actually came from. And the Bible is not giving you the original story. But we will dive into that even more in depth later.
Yeah, I think so. And it's fascinating to say that Yahweh didn't exist at the proposed time or the proposed two dates or the range of dates for the Exodus. Yahweh didn't exist. Israel didn't exist. The places to which they went weren't like you thought they were from the Bible. And actually, Moses didn't exist. Like, Moses was a later creation. We don't have any evidence that Moses was even thought of as an entity, because there are some precursors to the Exodus story in some of the older, say, prophet texts in the Pentateuch, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, and you would expect them to be kind of foreshadowing or replicating, or not replicating, because they're arguably there before. I mean, essentially what it looks like is that the Exodus story has been written very late and then thrown into the narrative of the nation, if you like, as they would have seen it when they were exiled, right? So you have the Hebrews exiled in Babylonia, wanting to establish their national identity because they are outside of Israel, some of these people, and they're feeling lost. So they write their own history. They are in bondage in exile, and so part of their story is to write about how they, the Hebrew people, escaped bondage themselves. So there's a shadowing of the experience of the Jewish people in exile in Babylonia, in bondage, arguably in Babylonia, saying, hey, our story is actually one of escaping bondage. And we escaped bondage from Egypt, except that when they proposed that happened, it couldn't have happened then because of all the stuff we've talked about. And there's no evidence of this happening inside Egypt. Egypt's got no knowledge of this. There's it's philosophically and theologically problematic. Like, the whole thing is just a story that was later written and retrofitted badly into the existing biblical narrative and the existing historical chronology. And really, Moses was a later creation. There were some echoes, not echoes, because they're not echoes of this thing. They are foreshadowing of this idea of Moses, arguably, that existed prior to the writing of the Moses story. And what we're trying to do in the book is try to establish, well, what was the original story of Moses, and where did Moses start featuring in the Bible, and then how did Moses come to be this hero that does X, Y, and Z. And it's really important because the whole of the Christian faith depends, I think, on this story being true. Like, when Matthew says that Jesus is fulfilling every jot and tittle of the law, then, well, you have to establish that the law existed as Moses set out, and this was the story of Moses. Well, if he's saying, as Matthew says, that Jesus is a kind of reincarnation of Moses, then what does it mean if Moses didn't exist and this story didn't exist? What does that say of Jesus if he's coming down saying, hey, I'm the new Moses? Well, like, Moses didn't exist. Oh dear. So there are huge problems here. So these are far more significant than I think people give credit for. So we'll talk about the missing Moses in another video. Is there anything you wanted to say before we just deal with some comments from the previous video?
Yeah, just one comment that popped up I noticed in the chat here about apparently us not going after other groups with fake histories as well. Believe me, ancient peoples have all sorts of fake histories that we don't believe about their origins. The Romans talking about Romulus and Remus, we don't believe that. The Herculoi talking about being children of Hercules, I don't believe that either. The Egyptians and their claims about having these great colonization missions and pretty much spreading culture all around the world, I don't believe that either. Why? Because I don't think the evidence adds up for that. It's actually pretty normal for people groups to create mythologies that aren't based on actual facts. And if we're doing this for money,
oh my God!
If I can be honest,
this
I don't know how much you have
here. Yeah. Righteous Kate, can I just put this to bed, because this is one of the worst comments ever. Hey, you got any other groups of people from back then with fake histories? As you mentioned, every other like mythology seen as a holy book. Like if you're a Christian, you don't believe all the other religious claims. So that's all those stories. Do you believe the creation myths of every single other tribe or religion in the world? No, you don't. So yeah, we agree with all of them. We just go one God further, as you know, Christopher Hitchens, I think, or was it Richard Dawkins, whoever it was, saying, you know, atheists and Christians are pretty similar. We just take it one God further. Like, so we all like don't believe those mythologies. So that's just a nonsense claim. But your book, that's spelled incorrectly, for money. If you think we're doing this for money, you have got something very, very wrong, right? I've written a dozen books on atheism, biblical exegesis, so on and so forth. And if you think I make serious money out of those books, unfortunately, no, they're very niche. And this is going to be a 450-page book on the historicity or lack thereof of the Exodus account. Your comment is ridiculous. Like, deal with the substance. This is just another example, like we had from someone else in the comments earlier, trying to pick an argument with cosmology and atheism. It's like, no, we're talking about the evolution of Yahweh here. So if you want to make a comment, deal with what we have proposed, what we set out here, which is established archaeology, by the way. Deal with the substance. Don't try and take this on to be an argument that it isn't. Sorry.
Yeah, and just to hammer this point, the vast majority of authors make less than $1,000 a year on their book sales. The reason we write books is for the love of the game. I have spent more on the research books than I probably will make in royalties, unless you all go and buy copies ahead of time right now. I should be promoting like that, but even if things work out well, I'd be lucky to break even. I am doing this because I think this subject is fascinating. I want to tell the world about what we've discovered because it's fundamentally interesting stuff, and it's enriching to know about it rather than to not know about it.
100%. And so what we do here is we actually look at some of the comments that are worthwhile comments, not like the one that we've just read, but we had some comments in the last, at the end of the last video. So the last video we did was titled, let's have a look. It was Doubting the Exodus, archaeological headaches and who came out of Egypt, right? Which is like looking at the process of the people group, the Hebrews coming out of Egypt, the lack of archaeological evidence for any of this, and the problems associated with that. And you had some comments that you wanted to deal with that shows that, hey, we are trying to do, because what we don't want to do is make arguments that do have genuine counters, then put this in a book without dealing with the counters. So if there are genuinely substantive arguments back against our position, then it is incumbent upon us to deal with that.
Yes, and I would say, remember the comments from last time. I think one of them that stood out to me is, apparently we shouldn't be relying on Israel Finkelstein. That was a bit of a weird one in my mind, because apparently, because Finkelstein has actually gone out of his way to publicly talk about the archaeology and saying, hey, the Exodus didn't happen, the United Monarchy probably didn't exist, everything we know about David and Solomon is pretty thin.
One of his most famous books, The Bible Unearthed, is that book there. But yes. Well, I've got a number of his other books as well. But that he is, sorry, just to give the people, some people won't know who he is. So he is a an Israeli archaeologist who has not come at his modern archaeology is not of the maximalist bent, which is to say we are going to start with the assumption that the Bible is true, then we're going to do the archaeology, and we are going to refer everything back to the truth of the Bible, and we are going to date everything that we find, and we're going to understand everything we find in the context of what we see as the truth of the Bible. Modern archaeologists say, hang on, that's the wrong way to do it. We're going to do the archaeology, we'll do our separate kind of analyses, and then we'll see if this fits into other claims such as we might find in the Bible, rather than vice versa. So anyway, and some people saying, well, you shouldn't rely on Finkelstein, but actually...
Yeah. And like I say, it's a bit weird because when I go to the meetings of the Society of Biblical Literature and American Association of Religion, when they do their combined thing, when Finkelstein is there, everyone is going to his talks. He is basically like the big celebrity at these talks. So when that person was saying like he's like been discredited and things like that, it's like not to the people who actually study this stuff. He is like the person that is widely respected. Not that everything he says is right or is without question, but he is, in his book, saying things that are pretty much consensus. And honestly, since his book came out from about 20 years ago, if anything, the situation has even gotten better for his position, or we found out the archaeology is even worse for the biblical stories in many cases. So like, for example, a good chunk of his argument is about how various parts of the Bible could have been written in like the 7th, 6th century BCE, or like just before the exile. And a lot of the archaeology is now coming back and saying, really, there doesn't even seem to be like good evidence of complex writing generally. Like there's barely enough evidence here for like any sort of like administrative stuff. And his claims that like, oh, maybe this tradition of seeing like the Greek hoplites helped influence this part and things like that. It seems like, if anything, instead of like the evidence coming in and better supporting the Bible, the evidence is coming in and pushing it even later and later of when these traditions actually became part of the biblical stories. So quite the opposite of what that commenter was suggesting.
This is very interesting, very important to note that actually more and more scholarly conclusions are aligning with a much later writing of the Bible. So there definitely seems to be a move to not to normalize, but it was previously thought that the post-exilic time period for writing much of what is now understood to be the Hebrew Bible that's just too late, and it was before that, and United Monarchy and blah blah blah, and actually it was written much further back here. But actually more and more there are scholars who are saying no, actually all the evidence is definitely supporting that it was, there are elements of pre-exilic, there's a lot of elements of exilic time period, but then actually more and more we are understanding to be post-exilic, which the exile was. What were the exact dates of the exile?
Roughly the 580s to the 530s, very, very roughly.
Yeah. So, and after that, and even some of it actually really quite late, because it's worth reiterating that the extant copies of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, are very, very late, like way later than people think. So if you were to ask a random on the street, you say, what do you think the earliest copy of the earliest fragment of text that we have from the Hebrew Bible? I reckon to a man, most people, or woman, most people would get that wildly wrong.
Yeah. And I should note, when it comes to Finkelstein not being alone, I have already earlier mentioned in this stream people like Jonathan Adler and Gad Bernea, who have been doing much to push against the antiquity of many of the traditions in the biblical tradition, the archaeology backing that up. William Deaver, retired professor of archaeology at Harvard. Also, the whole Exodus thing. Nope, that's not true. He basically says, yeah, he's been going more and more in the direction of where the quote-unquote minimalists have been pointing, at least when it comes to like the archaeological stuff, not necessarily maybe the textual traditions. But yeah, he says, hey, no Exodus, no conquest, not clear that there was a united monarchy. That is widely the consensus. I also recently had bought this book by Lester Grabe on ancient Israel, doing much to summarize a lot of the consensus or where the arguments are. And again, showing pretty much everyone is on the side that, hey, Exodus doesn't seem to be real. Conquest, no good evidence for it. we only begin to see things in the Bible that look historical once we get to the Iron Age, the monarchic period, and even the early stuff, we have to say, stuff that we're not sure about, but there was probably a David, and that's probably as far back as you can go with an historical biblical figure that we have reason to believe existed historically. Everything before that is a wash at best.
Yeah, yeah. Righteous Clay, I'm just going to throw this in there. Serious question for you two. Do you actually read the scriptures, or do you just study about them from other material? That's just a real insult.
Yeah. Well, I go back to the translations, the original texts. I have learned Greek. I am still learning more and more Hebrew, and I read the commentaries talking about the original text as well, the textual traditions, where there are differences. So like when I talked about earlier, Deuteronomy 32, the difference between the Hebrew in the Masoretic verses in the Dead Sea Scrolls versus the Greek translation, or the different versions of the Septuagint Greek translation as we see in both Greek and Latin witnesses. So I would say I've been looking at the scriptures and also realizing that the quote-unquote scriptures are a collection of texts that we cobble together and try to guesstimate what might have been an earlier version. So I'm trying to do my due diligence in these matters.
Yeah, so genuine question then from Righteous. So in all honesty, you know, if Aaron particularly, I mean, I haven't learnt Greek or Hebrew, but Aaron has, in order to read these in their original text. So not just reading the scriptures, but actually reading them in their in some of their original forms, depending on, you know, which text you're talking about. So yeah, the answer is yes, very much so. I've written a book on the nativity. This book we're talking about, the third book that we're releasing, well, sorry, the book that we're going to be releasing is the third in a trilogy of books that I've written. The nativity, a critical examination, the resurrection, a critical examination, the Easter story, and this is the Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story. And then also Aaron's written a book on the Star of Bethlehem as well. So, you know, there is a lot of analysis. We have done scriptural analysis, biblical exegesis. So yes, it's not just reading other people's books and then, I don't know, whatever. Although you have to do that too. You know, you have to be looking at all of the scholarly analyses on all of these, you know, both for and against these positions in order to steel man arguments and make sure that what we say actually has some purchase and has some foundation.
Yeah. And when it comes to the scholarship, you know, we've been looking at stuff in English, French, German, and of course, original material as much as possible. I've been learning Egyptian, both Middle Egyptian, Hieratic, Demotic, Coptic, so I can also try to access those sources to their, you know, originals as much as possible, especially when I try to make linguistic arguments. So
one of the chapters is an argument on the linguistic analysis of the word Moses, of the name Moses. So, you know,
and that was actually published in an Old Testament studies journal in the Scandinavian Journal of the Old Testament. So I convinced some other people that my Hebrew made some good Hebrew.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that question, Righteous Clay. And the answer is yeah, very much so, and more. And gone to town on linguistic analyses of the original language of some of these words and some of these texts.
Yes.
But thank you for that.
I will put you to sleep in this book about the difference between different sibilants. So everything you never wanted to know about the letter S.
Yes. Yeah. It really he does. He goes to town on it. I'm not saying he puts you to sleep. I won't be the judge of that. Okay. Any other comments from the last video that are worthy of any reply?
Let's see here. I also remember them mentioning... I have to
go and take my son now to an esports Rocket League competition. That's how cool he is.
All right. So very quickly, I remember the commenter also mentioning, hey, isn't there evidence of Yahweh in these Egyptian temples? That's actually what we started off with, where we actually show that exact same evidence shows the exact opposite. It shows that Yahweh was not even a god. It was a regional designation, and only centuries later did it finally become a divine name. So we responded to that right from the beginning. That was a comment worth highlighting. Those were the biggest things I remember from the comment section last time.
Yeah, and Mitch Ashdown has a comment here, which I want to dwell on a tiny bit, and we're kind of finish here. And I know you might have something to say about this. So Mitch says, "Shallow, but one can see how folks started believing stories, considering how folks today talk about movies as if they are real." And then what happens is you get this feedback loop that takes place. I wrote an article once on why I think the title was something like "Why do normal people believe ridiculous things?" And it's the idea that people believe the Noah's Ark story, the Noah's flood story. And when you look at the claims of the Noah's flood story, they are absolutely insanely ridiculous. Now, that may be an insult to someone like, for example, Righteous Clate, who might believe it to be historically true and be the foundation of his belief system vis-a-vis the Bible. But the problems with the Noah's flood story are epically obvious. Like, there's more water than there are water molecules on Earth in order to do what is supposed to have been done. The weight of the water around the world would implode the Earth's crust. You wouldn't be able to get all the animals from around the world. Blah blah blah. Like I wrote like something like a non-exhaustive list of 25 reasons why the story is absolutely batshit crazy. Right? It is just nuts. Not least that God, all powerful, all knowing, with foreknowledge, got design so wrong that he had to start again because he had cocked up the first time. Like, that's the nature of this. It's like, oh, humans are so wicked, which he would have known about previously. Like, he had to restart again, like clear the table and then, recreate humanity. So anyway, it's ridiculous. But the idea is that why do people believe ridiculous things? That is partly because they hear these stories that they get embedded in their minds at a very young age. So take Noah's Ark story. You have songs about it. You've got cartoon books. The animals go on the ark 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah, and it just gets normalized. And then the story becomes part of your baggage, particularly for lifelong believers. And then when you learn how to differentiate plausible from implausible, when you start doing science, when you start understanding how the world really works, what you do is you apply that metric to other religions, and you say, well, that's ridiculous. That story is never going to have happened. That's clearly mythological, but you don't apply it to your own beliefs that have been embedded prior to the point of learning these skills. And so something like Noah's Ark becomes part of your identity, part of your cultural baggage almost, and it is not victim to the same analysis that you apply to other religious claims. This is why John Loftus wrote the book The Outsider Test for Faith. You need to take yourself outside of your faith in order to apply all of those tools that you apply to other faiths to your own faith to make sure that it is justifiably believable. And something like the Noah's flood is just an obscenely ridiculous story, but yet a lot of people believe it. So yeah, I think I feel really strongly about that. There is definitely an element of learning things very early and then bypassing vetoes.
Ooh, and yeah.
Sorry, I had to just tell my son to stop shouting at his computer.
Well, I need to start shouting at my workstation as well. So
yes. The comeback to this was, indeed, I do believe the whole of the Bible, given that I believe it is the inspired word of God. And here's the problem. Here's the problem is that if you start believing it's the inspired word of God, this is like, you have this preconceived notion that it is true before that you apply the tools to analyze that. You just start with the idea that it's true, and then you go from there. Rather, you argue. The problem here, no offense, Righteous, but this is really common. This is arguing from the Bible rather than to the Bible. And what we're doing with a book like ours is we're saying, look, these are the tools that you use for every other religion. You should use it for your own religion. You should use it for your own beliefs and see whether you can argue to your Bible. But starting from your Bible and arguing from there is exactly the wrong way you should go about it, because then you can use exactly that approach to argue for any other holy book in the world, and you're inoculating yourself from criticism and from changing your mind, because you just start with the preconceived ideal that I am correct, this is the word of God, end of, therefore it has to be, by default, it has to be true.
At the very least, if your approach is to defend the beliefs in the same way that a Muslim apologist would, from the same kind of evidence that you think this is inspired, well, guess what? You are at an impasse. That's why the outsider test for faith that Loftus has is so powerful and useful. And if you think that you can actually externally prove your beliefs from secular evidence sources, and that, we want to hear about that. But if it's just the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it, you would not believe that in any other context. Why is that? Once you realize why, you can we'll be able to have a more fruitful conversation.
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you very much for your time, Aaron. Thank you to the people in the live chat. It's been a long one. We'll do this again somewhat soon. We'll talk about the missing Moses, and we'll maybe even talk about his name. Get yourself a pillow, get comfortable, because as Aaron said, he might well bore you with linguistic analysis.
Yeah, we will be using the writing system from the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA. That works well when you are drinking an IPA.
Yes, and I'm sure we're going to put some IPA joke in the book somewhere. It has to happen. Well, look, mate. Yes, yeah. Thank you so much for everything, and you take good care of yourself. And thanks to all the audience.
Bye all.